For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Good morning.
Yesterday, South Africans were celebrating the Freedom Charter. Can you tell us a bit about the formation of this important document?
Yes, I didn't notice a lot of celebration, I must say, because I think people have a sort of ritualistic attitude to the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter is something that you must not fall foul of if you're in the ANC or the EFF. I think even the DA says it supports the Freedom Charter. But I think people have stopped thinking about the Freedom Charter. They treat it like a shopping list. It's got a list of things. Did we do this? Tick. Did we do that? Tick. Same with the Constitution. And I don't think it was meant to be like that. But what is different about the Freedom Charter historically compared with other human rights documents is that it was not developed by a panel of experts. It was not a lot of professors who sat together and decided that the best way to govern South Africa is this, that and the other way. In the ANC's history, it did have a Bill of Rights, I think in 1923 or 1919, I'm not sure. And then it had the African claims. After the Atlantic Charter in the World War II, it developed its own claims for the future. Atlantic Charter dealt with how they wanted the post-war peace to be. The African claims got together a lot of intellectuals from the ANC and other organizations, but mainly the ANC, and they developed a human rights document. Now, the Freedom Charter was different in that it was not developed on the 25th and 26th of June, on the day when it was adopted. It was part of a process where there was a call that was issued to everyone, wherever they were, on the land, off the land, homeless, with homes, workers, teachers, students, to say what type of South Africa they wanted. And volunteers, there had already been volunteers in the Defiance campaign. Volunteers would go around to all these places and they would listen to people. Some people would write out their own demands for the Charter. I want this, I want that. Freedom Charter volunteers would also be instructed to listen. Their job was not to argue with these people and say, why do you say that? They were supposed to listen, write it down, then go away. So this process went on for some months, and you must remember things were very difficult at those times in terms of traveling. How did you get from one place to another? The ANC and its allies, it wasn't just the ANC, Congress, Indian Congresses, Congress of Democrats, Coloured People's Congress, and the South African Congress of Trade Unions. All of them worked together gathering demands. And some people say, it was just developed by a committee later. The way I understand it is, after this process, there were thousands of demands, sometimes on scraps of paper, sometimes written on the back of a cigarette box, all sorts of things like that. And the committee that had to put it into the form of the Freedom Charter that we know today obviously couldn't include every demand that they received. So what they did is they took what was common to these demands, and that became the Freedom Charter. Now, in some cases it may have been debatable. Also, it may have been that there were some parts that were thin and that they needed to include some things that were related to it. Now, even though there was some controversy about the Freedom Charter afterwards, it was adopted on the day, but it was also adopted in a number of meetings. It received very good response from people, although the PAC broke away and a number of other people on the left as well as Africanists have always criticized the Freedom Charter. Nevertheless, the power of the Freedom Charter is demonstrated by the fact that it still commands respect over 60 years after the event. And by the way, it wasn't an ANC document. ANC adopted it 1 year later. And some people had been unhappy, like people like Chief Lutuli had not been at the Congress of the People. He had been restricted to Groutville, and he was not happy about the clause on nationalisation, things like that. And however, he was persuaded that the overall tenor was something he had to support, and he did support it as being one of the most democratic documents. And it's lasted, but I think it needs to be interpreted in the context of our times.
We know that the document also called for a fundamental restructuring of all aspects of South African society. Can you tell us some of the important issues that are addressed?
Well, you know, we must look at it in the context of apartheid South Africa. Education, about 15 times as much was being spent on a white child as on an African child. Now state schools are supposed to be spending the same amount on everyone today. The law was not equal. There were pass laws. Thousands of people were being arrested for pass laws every year. There was Bantu education, which was meant to teach African people not to aspire to be anything other than a labourer. Dr. Verwoerd said, what is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when he will never use it in practice? Now that is the time in which they were doing it. So by its very nature, it was very radical, indeed revolutionary, in relation to apartheid South Africa. But there are some aspects of it regarding the land and regarding the banks and things like this, which would be radical in relation to what we've got today. And I think there needs to be a lot of debate about what it means. I don't think the Freedom Charter is meant to be taken literally, that every single word in the year 2018 has to be followed to the letter. It's the spirit that we have to capture, the spirit of freedom and emancipatory thinking.
And what would you say if we look at the ruling party? Do you think it's on par with what is addressed in this charter?
Well, you know, I don't want to get into the ticking of boxes. You know, they did this, they did that. I think we must remember that under ANC government, a lot of things have happened in the period since 1994. Something like social grants with all the problems. It's not mentioned in the charter as far as I can remember, although they do mention things that are similar. Some of the labour legislation, the numbers of people that are in schools and universities has exploded. But you can't be on par when something like 100 billion has been stolen through state capture. You can't be on par when there is a sense that the ANC has lost the excitement that they had at this time. The ANC today doesn't evoke excitement. It evokes a sense of cynicism that these are just people who want money.
And lastly, what else would you like to remind South Africans when it comes to the Freedom Charter?
Well, the way I would want people to look at the Freedom Charter is, I used to say not like the Bible, but some people say the Bible must be interpreted by the letter, by the spirit and not the letter. In other words, we've got to understand what is the main central driving ideas of the Freedom Charter. And when we look at some of the clauses that are out of date today because you don't have some of these apartheid provisions, we've got to ask ourselves, in the spirit of the Freedom Charter, what has come in its place? Does it match up to the idea of freedom that the people wanted, freedom volunteers, and the ANC and its allies, and a wide range of other people wanted then? They've got to use their minds critically to understand the Freedom Charter.
Thank you, Professor. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the Freedom Charter.